History remembers D-Day as a triumph, but it was nearly a catastrophe. The largest invasion ever staged was a series of compounding failures that almost ended in a massacre. The landings on June 6, 1944, are often seen as an inevitable victory. But the reality on Omaha Beach was a chaotic, bloody disaster. Within the first hour, the plan for the 34,000 Americans landing there had completely evaporated. Thousands of men were pinned against the seawall, facing a barrage of German lead, with nowhere to go and no armor to support them. General Omar Bradley, commander of the American First Army, was watching from the USS Augusta. He was so convinced the landing had failed that he began contemplating an evacuation of the beach and diverting reinforcements elsewhere. If he had sent that signal, the liberation of Europe would have died in the surf. This is the story of how thin the line was between the victory we remember and the total collapse of D-Day. The invasion plan relied on 5 separate landings: Utah and Omaha for the Americans in the West, and Gold, Juno, and Sword for the British and Canadians to the east. But Omaha was the critical hinge for the entire operation. A failure here meant that the American forces at Utah would be cut off and isolated, collapsing the entire western flank before the first day was over. Omaha was a natural killing zone where a 170-foot cliff surrounded a narrow strip of sand. The German bunkers were cut directly into the cliff face, rendering them immune to Allied bombers. This left the infantry with only one option: a slow, uphill assault on foot across open ground while under fire from 3 sides at once. Planners knew Omaha was the most heavily defended beach in Normandy. This was a target that required double the firepower, but they instead chose to standardize the assault. So Omaha was given the same naval support as the easiest beaches along the coast. Admiral John Hall, the naval commander for the Omaha assault, later called that allocation a crime. But the planners hadn't just underestimated the terrain, they had also misidentified the enemy. The Allied plan assumed the Americans landing at Omaha would be fighting a few thousand low-quality garrison troops, conscripts and older men with no combat experience. But they were wrong. Just weeks before the invasion, the 352nd Infantry Division, 12,000 battle-hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, had just moved into the sector, which meant the first waves of American troops didn't drop their ramps into a crumbling defense. They instead hit a wall of men who had spent years surviving the Soviet Union. 4 miles west of Omaha Beach sat Pointe du Hoc, a massive cliff-top position where intelligence reported 6 155mm German guns capable of shelling the entire invasion fleet. The threat of these guns forced the Allied fleet to anchor 12 miles offshore, a distance that would prove fatal for the timing of the assault. It meant the 2nd Ranger Battalion, tasked with scaling the cliffs at the point, and the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, who were bound for Omaha, had to endure 3 hours in slow Higgins boats while being pounded by 6-foot waves. But those German guns had already been moved inland days before the invasion, so thousands of American soldiers were forced to endure a grueling journey because of a threat that didn't exist. By the time they approached the coast, the men were soaked, freezing, and violently seasick. That 12-mile journey also destroyed the synchronization of the assault. The plan relied on DD tanks, Sherman tanks fitted with canvas screens to swim to shore and provide cover. But the distance was too great for the canvas to hold back the channel. 27 of the 32 tanks sank almost immediately, stripping the infantry of their only armor. While the tanks disappeared, the heavy current dragged the 1st and 29th Divisions into the wrong sectors and pulled the Rangers miles away from the point. Therefore, the assault forces dropped their ramps 40 minutes late, while drifting directly into concentrated German crossfire. With the tanks at the bottom of the channel, the infantry's only hope for cover was aerial bombardment. But because of thick cloud cover, Allied pilots were terrified of hitting their own men. They waited just a few extra seconds to release their payloads, but it was a delay that sent 13,000 bombs screaming past the coast and into the empty fields behind. leaving every German bunker and machine gun defending the beach completely intact. These tactical collapses were compounded by a command breakdown. The 2nd Ranger Battalion lost their commanding officer hours before the operation, when Major Randy Ladle was relieved for drunken behavior, forcing Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder to take command at the last minute. So when the first units hit the sand, the Allied plan had already failed. They were landing without armor or air cover against a German force that hadn't lost a single position. The first ramps dropped at Omaha at 6:30 a.m. 3 minutes later, the Special Engineer Task Forces hit the beach with a single mission: blow 16 clear lanes through the German obstacles so the thousands of vehicles waiting offshore could reach the sand. They had just 27 minutes to work before the tide submerged the mines. But because the DD tanks had sunk, the engineers had no covering fire. They were forced to try and clear the path for the invasion's armor, while the very tanks meant to protect them were at the bottom of the channel. Under concentrated German fire and without a single armored shield, the demolition plan collapsed in minutes. By 8 a.m., the shore had ceased to be a landing zone. The rising tide pushed incoming boats into a maze of submerged mines and jagged steel. Hundreds of landing craft were unable to reach the sand, yet the weight of the fleet behind them kept pushing them forward. The result was a floating logjam of men and machines, trapped under fire they couldn't escape. This disaster was made even deadlier by a total collapse in communication. The radios meant to call for help had been soaked or shattered in the surf, leaving the men pinned against the seawall with no way to tell the fleet to redirect the incoming waves. This left General Bradley on the USS Augusta in a state of near total isolation, forced to guess the status of the invasion based on the smoke and the mounting wreckage he could see through his binoculars. The crisis peaked when Bradley concluded Omaha was a catastrophe. The hinge of the Allied line was snapping, forcing him to contemplate a signal for a full-scale retreat. Pulling out would tear a 37-mile gap between the Allied lines and split the invasion in half. But just as he prepared to abandon the beach, the first coherent reports finally reached the Augusta. Small groups of men with no unit structure or armor had started moving up the ridges on their own. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was enough. Bradley held the order, gambling the entire invasion on the initiative of men he couldn't even see through the smoke. Brigadier General Norman Cota, the 51-year-old assistant commander of the 29th Division, realized that staying behind the seawall meant certain death. He stood up in the crossfire and personally led a group of men toward a line of beach houses at the base of the cliffs, blowing through wire obstacles with a Bangalore torpedo and leading the first organized group off the sand. This recovery was only possible because the Navy took a gamble that risked grounding their own ships. At 8:30 a.m., the captains of destroyers like the USS McCook saw the infantry being butchered and realized the heavy cruisers anchored far offshore were too distant to help. So they broke formation and steered directly toward the shore until they were nearly scraping the sand, closing to within 800 yards of the German positions. They fired their 5-inch guns at point-blank range, skipping shells directly into the concrete slits of the fortifications. While it didn't fix the wreckage on the beach, it provided the men climbing the cliffs the brake they needed to keep moving. While those first breaches were forming on the beach, a separate tactical disaster was unfolding 4 miles to the west at Pointe du Hoc. At 7:10 a.m., the 2nd Ranger Battalion reached the base of the 100-foot cliffs and scaled them under a rain of grenades. Yet when they reached the top and cleared the bunkers at 7:40 a.m., they found no artillery. The massive 155mm guns were gone, forcing the Rangers to push inland to find them. This triggered a confused battle through the dense hedgerows as small groups of men hunted for the battery while under fire from German reinforcements. It wasn't until 11:10 a.m. that they found the guns hidden in an orchard a quarter-mile inland, pointed at the beaches, but completely unmanned. They disabled them with grenades, but because their radio was destroyed, they couldn't signal the success. This silence was fatal. The invasion plan dictated that if the fleet received no success signal from the point by 7 a.m., the remaining Ranger companies were to be diverted to Omaha Beach. Because the fleet assumed the mission had failed, these reinforcements were sent into Omaha's deadliest sector. As a result, hundreds of men were cut apart in the surf, dying in a secondary landing zone because the fleet didn't know the primary objective had already been destroyed. By noon, the immediate risk of collapse had passed. However, the invasion remained incredibly fragile. The Allies were split into 5 isolated pockets, which meant they couldn't move supplies between them. This left them as 5 separate targets, inviting a German strike into the gaps that could have cut the entire invasion to pieces. Those isolated pockets survived only because of a total breakdown in German command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of the German defenses, was in Germany for his wife's birthday when the invasion landed, leaving his staff to spend 4 hours trying to reach him on the phone. While they waited for a response, the local German reserves that should have crushed the first American wave at Omaha were left sitting in their barracks waiting for orders. But the collapse of leadership extended even beyond Rommel. In a messy compromise, the German tank force had been split in 2. A few units were under local command, but the most powerful panzer divisions were held in a strategic reserve that only Hitler could release. But Hitler was asleep, and his staff were convinced the real attack would happen at Calais, so they refused to wake him. By the time he finally authorized those reserves to move in the mid-afternoon, nearly 10 hours of critical response time had been lost. This left the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit free to move without Hitler's permission, facing the invasion alone. With 127 tanks and roughly 16,000 men, they managed to drive a wedge between the British and Canadian sectors, reaching the coast and proving how easily the isolated beachheads could be severed. But when Allied gliders began flying over their heads at dusk, the division was pulled back due to a fear of being encircled. Germany's one serious armored threat of the day failed not because it was defeated, but because it flinched at the wrong moment. D-Day was a collision of massive numbers and desperate improvisation. By nightfall, 156,000 Allied troops were in France, but that foothold cost 4,400 confirmed dead. The center of that carnage was Omaha. Of the 34,000 Americans who hit that sand, 2,400 were killed or wounded before the first day was over. Omaha was nearly the complete undoing of the invasion. If those men hadn't found a way up the cliffs, the Allied line would have been split by a 37-mile gap, leaving the American and British forces unable to reach each other. This collapse was only avoided because Allied soldiers ignored the failed plans and moved on their own, while the German response was paralyzed by a broken command structure. Because Rommel was absent and the panzers were locked behind Hitler's personal red tape, the Germans missed their only window to drive the Allies back into the sea. However, that narrow survival carried a heavy price, because the disaster at Omaha delayed the link-up of the Allied beachheads until June 12th. The Germans were given a full week to turn the Normandy hedgerows into a fortress. Therefore, the near failure on the sand became a strategic tax, a debt paid in blood across the entire summer. But the chaos at Omaha started long before the first ramps dropped. To see the nerve-wracking weather gamble that nearly ended the invasion before it even began, click the video on screen now. And if you want more deep dives into the turning points of history, like this video and subscribe.